Hi, this is Scott, Kilo Sierra 6, Delta Alpha Yankee, also WRTI 407, because we're going to be talking GMRS today. And what we're going to be taking a look at today is the new Baofeng UV Golf Plus, which is a GMRS radio. Now, there is an identical or nearly identical version of this called the UV-5RM that's intended for the ham radio service, but this particular version is GMRS specific. Now, the first thing that you're going to notice is, well, that looks like a Baofeng UV5R with a little bit bigger screen, but it's a bit more than that. Here's a size comparison. It is indeed quite a bit larger than the UV5R. It looks a lot like a UV5R and takes all of its external styling cues from the UV5R and very familiar look that a lot of us are used to. Many of us, myself included, started with a Baofeng UV5R, so there is a sense of the familiar here. But it is indeed something quite different internally. So I'll go over the external comparisons to the UV5R in a moment, but let me talk about where it differs quite critically, actually, and that's what's inside of this case, because it is anything but a UV5R. It is, in fact, a GMRS version of the UV-17 series radios. Now, I very favorably reviewed the UV-17R quite a while back, and I was impressed with its features, and it's a definite step forward for Baofeng into developing into a better, more refined product. But I did notice that there was no GMRS version of the UV-17R out there. Well, it's right here. It just takes a different external form. And I'll show you that in a moment when we actually turn the radio on and start looking at how the radio operates, because again, it's all UV-17R. But let's take a look at those external comparisons here. The reasons for why they would do this, hard to say. I'm sure someone in the marketing department had the thought that, hey, there's the sense of familiar is going to be, it's going to appeal to the folks that really do like the UV5R. So I sort of get that. But when I say this thing is quite a bit bigger, I mean, it's bigger in every single way. It is taller, it is thicker, and it is wider than the UV5R all the way around, and I'm sure that's to fit the larger internal circuitry necessary for the UV-17 system, but I don't know. At first I was like, well, why the hell would I like that? And then I got my hands on it and I went, well, it's actually kind of interesting. I do sort of like it. So let's take a look at those real fast. You'll notice that everything, while it has a UV5R look, everything is bigger, although all the usual stuff is in the same spot. We have our VFO, MR, or memory remote button, or A, B band. The band keys a little bit different color, and then when we get to the front panel, all the keys are larger, but they have a couple of different things on them. Of course, we don't have menu and exit. We got green and red, but they do the same thing. When we go to the PTT side of the radio, boy, does it get real similar there. But again, everything is a little bit bigger. Now, I will say the switchery feels kind of identical, actually, just larger versions of same. When we move to the speaker mic port side, though, I will say the original UV5R speaker mic cover I would prefer because it folds back out of the way. On the UV5 Golf Plus, and you got to be careful with that because there is a UV5 Golf that's just basically a GMRS version of the small UV5R, so you got to throw that plus part in there. If I forget to do that, just know, hey, this is what I'm talking about. So the speaker mic port, again, this one folds down out of the way. I don't really like this particular setup because with the speaker mic plugged in, it has a tendency to do that. It's a pain in the ass getting it in and out of a pouch, and it's always going to be bumping onto things. And it doesn't really come off completely without full destruction of the cover, as far as I can tell. I wish there was a little screw here so you could get rid of that, but it is what it is. If you're going to be using a speaker mic a lot, might as well just rip it and forget it. So, but that speaker mic port, again, typical K1 type plug setup, and that you have your 2.5 and 3.5 millimeter plug sets. So nothing too outrageous there. Moving to the top of the radio, you do have that same similar faceted type knob, which I always thought was kind of interesting looking. You have a much better flashlight if that's your thing. I'm sort of ambivalent on the topic of flashlights on radios. I carry flashlights, so I don't really see a need for these, but I've used them from time to time. But if you're into flashlights, boy, the one on this one really kicks ass because it's more than just an exposed LED. It is in fact an LED with a reflector. So it's a much more potent flashlight, if you will. Same SMA connections for the antenna. Now moving to the back of the radio, big departure here, much better clip on the UV5 Golf Plus. You have a pinned, the actual pin for the belt clip is staked, so it's not going to do the thing that the UV5R likes to do where the pin walks out and the clip falls off. And the clip on the UV5R always been pretty flimsy. This one's quite a bit more robust and durable. Now when we get to the batteries, here we see some definite some similarities and in some ways not a good thing, but if you know how to handle this, you'll avoid any trouble. But they feature the same battery latches. Now on the UV5R and the UV5 Golf Plus, on both of them, you just press that in, pull the battery down, and you can remove it from the radio. Same story here. And that reveals to us that rather than the UV5R's 1800 milliamp battery, we have a 2500 milliamp battery, which is kind of cool. You know, and obviously larger case size, larger battery, so you have a little bit more battery life to play with there. The battery contacts are in a different spot. They're not at the top, they're on the back. Now, when I was talking about a downside to this, this has been something I've talked about before when I've talked about UV5Rs, and that is when you are inserting the battery onto the radio. One thing you don't want to do is drive this home until it clicks. Now, I'll do it just to show you what it sounds like. So what a lot of people will do is slide it on and then just click it into place. Doesn't seem like a big deal, right? Well, here's the problem. In order for that battery to click into place, this tab here that locks the battery in place is kind of a hook arrangement. It has to deflect ever so slightly when it's going into position. Now in doing so, what will happen is after a time, you'll overcycle this and this will actually snap off. And I know this because I've had it happen a couple of times where I've destroyed the battery latch by pressing it in place. So I adopted the procedure of sliding the battery in place and then holding the latch down, slide it home and release the latch. No click, no stress to the tab, and you're not going to have a problem. Now, on the UV5 Golf, everything being, you know, equivalently bigger, this is thicker through here, so I don't know if that'll be the same problem, but the same set of circumstances are there. So conceivably, you could have the same problem with that snapping off. So just as a matter of practice, just get in the habit of holding that battery latch down, slide the battery home, release it, give it a tug, make sure it's locked in place, and you're good to go. Now here's where it gets kind of interesting. I'm going to have to turn around and grab something because I forgot something. Hold on. Alrighty, we got it. Now, one thing that the UV5R has had going for it for a while, and for that matter, the BFF8, which is just the kind of slightly more robust version of the UV5R and higher output wattage, is the infamous BL5L Extendo battery. Now, this is a battery that kicks you up from 1800 milliamps to 3800 milliamps, and if you buy them from the right place, it can be a good battery, but there are some scammers out there, so be careful. But with this one, because the battery latch is at the top of the radio, the length of the battery is not defined by the bottom of the case. Now, not necessarily with the UV17, let me grab another radio where it might make some more sense. So we'll take a look at this UV9 Golf. Now, its battery latch is at the bottom. So what that means is the battery really can't be any longer than the case of the radio, otherwise you're not going to be able to latch it in place. But because the latch is at the top, they could come out with this extendo battery design. And if you look at the bottom of the UV5R, it has these two little hooks here, these little tabs, okay? Now what they interface with is this little built-up ridge on the battery itself, and that's what holds it together and keeps the battery from bowing out in this direction. So that allows you to put, of course, the infamous extendo battery on this radio. So what I'm thinking is, if you look at the bottom of these two radios, everything is identical but larger. So it begs the question, do we have a gigantic extendo battery in you know, as a potential item for the future? If that's the case, then the UV5 Golf Plus and the UV5 RM, given that you could conceivably kick it up anywhere from 2,000 to 2,500 milliamps. Do we have a potential future of a 5,000 milliamp battery being available for this? I think so. Obviously Baofeng, somebody there has had to tumble to that being, a potential possible accessory for this radio. So I'm looking to see if that happens. That would be kind of slightly interesting. So I'll keep you posted. Maybe what we'll end up with is some kind of slightly smaller version of the AR-152, which, if you'll note, utilizes that same concept of the battery latch at the top and then indexing off the bottom of the radio for this big old gigundous, I think it's 12,500 milliamp battery, or milliamp hour battery. So if that's the case, that could be interesting. Now, that's the external similarities to the UV-5R. At this point, forget everything you know about the UV-5R. Whereas the UV-5R and a lot of the legacy Baofeng models feature that 128 channel monochrome display system that we're all most of us are very, very familiar with. The UV-5 Golf Plus and the UV-5RM are going to be a completely different animal when you turn those on, because again, internally, all UV-17R stuff. So when you turn this on, the first similarity you're going to note is that both radios, of course, have the colored display. In the case of the UV-17R, it's a black background. With the UV-5 Golf Plus, it's more of a royal blue, not a dark blue, but not a light blue either, and white lettering on both, which is great. Now, the specifications, which I haven't really talked about up to this point, but with the UV-5 Golf Plus, of course, it is a GMRS radio, so you're locked into the typical 22 simplex channels and 8 repeater channels associated with the General Mobile Radio Service, or GMRS. You do have the ability, though, to monitor for receive purposes only, no transmit. You can monitor in the VHF band 136 to 174 megahertz and UHF 400 to I believe it's, let me check here, 400 to 520. So with that, you can monitor public safety, you can monitor amateur radio. There's a lot of stuff that you can pack onto this. And you can do so pretty liberally because it has a 999 memory channel capacity. Now, of course, 30 of those channels are taken up by default from the factory because you get your 22 simplex channels and your 8 DIY channels for GMRS are already pre-installed on the operating system. And of course, for the UV-5RM version, it's going to be kind of the inverse opposite. You can transmit in the U.S. amateur radio bands, but you can't transmit outside of that. Now, it always does beg the question: is there an unlock code for either of these radios? And the answer to that, just like the UV-17R, is still no. I'm sure. Well, actually, it may be possible that Baofeng may have designed these with no unlock code at all, because they got spanked pretty vigorously by the European Union. A lot of people think it was the American FCC that locked them down, but from what I've heard, it was actually the EU that said you either get a handle on the expanded transmit thing or we'll ban your product from our fiefdom. So they all of the newer stuff, the older legacy stuff, they did put codes on them, but a lot of people know the unlock code procedure. But on the really newer stuff with this new 999 memory channel color display type operating system, as far as I know, there's no unlock codes for these, so you're kind of locked in. So that's why you do have the two different identical versions. So if you want to operate both services, you're going to have to, at least for now, you're going to have the two different radios, which some see as a huge disadvantage. I don't like it myself. I like to have the capability to do expanded transmit because that's just kind of how I operate. But let's get back to the similarities in operating systems here. So we have our displays, black versus royal blue. Now, something I don't care for on the UV-5 Golf Plus, and I'm sure the UV-5RM has the same setup, is the color of the text on the menus. Now, the menus on these radios, and this is really what'll show you that these are basically the same radios internally, is when you press your menu key, here we got white lettering on a black background, but when you press your menu key on this one, and it's going to be hard to see, it is red lettering on a blue background, which is very difficult to see. If you can't see it on the camera, trust me, I can't see it hardly at all right now with my eyeballs. So moving through the menu selections, one thing that you'll note as you go through the menu selections is that the menu selections for both radios are absolutely identical for all 45 selections on here. They are exactly the same thing and exactly in the same spot. So if you already are familiar with the UV-17 series radios, or UV-17R in particular, because the UV-17 Pro GPS, for instance, is a totally different animal. But like I said, they're identical in terms of carrying out menu functions. So let's exit out of this real quick. Okay. So yeah, that's what you have internally. It's a fairly easy radio to operate from the front panel via the front panel keys in the menu. So my overall impressions of the radio are fairly favorable, actually. In terms of transmit and receive performance, you know, I haven't put this on any kind of a spectrum analyzer. More on that in the future. I got some things to say about a spectrum analyzer company that did a really tricky little dangle on me, and I don't know if it was a scam or if they were just messing with me, but I'll do a separate video on that later. But the so all of my performance is going to be pure anecdotal testimony per se, and that's kind of the way with all the radios that I test. I don't really get too deep into the technical aspects of things, because for a lot of folks that are watching this, they literally could care less about some of that stuff. What they want to know is when you're operating the radio, does it work for you? And I do have certain scenarios and situations that I set up where I can compare the performance of radios. I have a couple of areas in my particular area of operations where it's a challenge to get a radio signal through. I have some areas where I know there's a high presence of RF interference, and I sort of select these out, and then whenever I'm testing a radio, I'll get it in and I'll work with it for about a week to a week and a half. I'll make it my everyday carry radio, so I can get a really good feel for this. So here's what I can say about their performance. In terms of signal reports, typical for Baofeng. Baofeng's, by nature of, I'm guessing, whoever they subcontract their microphone out to, they all kind of sound about the same. Baofeng's have a little bit of a kind of a whooshing sound to their microphones. People have called it the Baofeng Ocean. I can usually tell. I'm getting pretty good at picking up when someone is talking to me over, particularly on simplex. Now with repeaters, it's not always the same, because repeaters it's a little different in terms of the signal quality you get. Most repeaters, there's a degradation on the signal just by virtue of the fact that it's being sent, it's being received and then sent out by a completely different system. So often it'll accurately reflect the signal, but there's always going to be a little bit of artifact on there, a little bit of hiss. With simplex, that's where you really make a determination on how good or bad a microphone can be. And like I say, it's a little bit of ever so slight hiss on there. It's not bad. In fact, it's good to go. I don't have a real problem with it. Reception on this, I'm going to factor this in for the antenna. The reception on this radio is not as good as some other Baofengs. For instance, the reception on this radio is not as good as the reception on this radio. Now, given that they have pretty much identical receivers within the radios, they're just set up for, well, they're really not set up for anything. It's not a factor of transmission, it's a factor of reception. So the receivers should be identical between the two radios. This one receives better than this one. Now, could it come down to either the component assembly within the radio or the antenna? Now, one thing I tried was I swapped the antennas out, and it didn't really change much. And what I mean by the reception is, this didn't go deaf any more than this went deaf. They received the same signals just fine. It's just on this radio, the quality of the signal that I was getting through the speaker was a little bit better than the UV-5 Golf Plus. The UV-5 Golf Plus, regardless of what I was listening to, had a little bit of hiss and static on it. So that could be just again a minor inconsistency in the construction of the internal components. Who knows? But I will say this: adequate to task. I'm going to be honest with you, when it comes to $35 radios, and that's what this costs us, $35. When it comes to $35 radios, if you're looking for ICOM level performance, you're not going to get it ever. And if you hold this radio to that same standard, it's an unfair comparison. So what I like to do when it comes to the subject of cheap Chinese radios in general and Baofengs in general is I manage my expectations, and I say this. If you were able to send and receive a signal and you understood the signal you received and they understood the signal that you sent, the fact that it wasn't perfect full quieting performance is a real minor little nitpick, particularly when I'm used to some of the radios I was using 20 or 30 years ago. 20 or 30 years ago, these things would be considered marvels of engineering. Now people turn to, well, you know, it didn't give me, it didn't perform as well as my ICOM ICT-10 or my, you know, ID52 Alpha. Well, okay. You could buy 2 cases of these radios for that price. And I know I'm using Baofeng economics, and that's something I'm critical of, but look, it is what it is. So for someone who is on a challenging budget, and they're trying to make their money stretch as far as possible, for someone who has to buy a lot of radios, maybe for a group, something like these little $35 radios, if it's a good, you know, good radio, might as well recommend. So in terms of, you know, looking at it reasonably from the perspective that it is just a $35 radio, this isn't half bad. I got to admit, it's Baofeng is getting better at what they do. Now, I don't like the UV-5R, and a lot of the older Baofeng radios. They have a cheap, chintzy little feel to them, and they sort of feel toy-like. But as Baofeng is introducing these newer models, that argument is getting harder and harder to present, because these things are actually not half bad. So when it comes to the Baofeng UV5 Golf Plus, if you're a GMRS person out there and you're looking for something new to play with and fiddle with, this is good to go. It'll get you through. Programming is a little bit of an issue in that you have to use the factory CPS to program this radio. It's not supported by Chirp yet, but the people at Chirp, if there's one radio that one radio brand that they will cater to pretty heavily, it's always going to be Baofeng. So I would suggest that within a short matter of time, they'll have a build out for this particular series of radios. If anything, you know, some variation of the UV-17 will carry over to this. So we'll see. I'm sure sometime in the very near future, Chirp will be available for this. So I think I've kind of covered about all I can on this. So like I say, $35 radio, a nice little kick around GMRS radio, feels durable too. I didn't talk about my general impressions here. When it comes to UV-5R, it feels sort of hollow and toy-like, but much like the UV-17R that this is based on, this has pretty substantial feel. Feels nice and tough. So yeah, I think that's about it. So I'm going to go ahead and bring it to a close at this time. And thank you for watching and or listening. This is Scott, Kilo Sierra 6, Delta Alpha Yankee, also WRTI 407 from Visalia, California. Have a wonderful day.